Hello and welcome to Robbie and James Talk Music, the podcast where Robbie and James talk music. We're your hosts, Robbie Maxted, a creative writing professor.
And I'm James Wicks, professor of media and film studies.
This week's episode is a year episode where we're going to zero in on songs and media from a particular year. Previously, we've done some decade episodes, and so we were like, let's dial it in specifically on a particular year. Today's episode, we're looking at the year 1986. Today, I'm going to kick us off with Prince and the Revolution's Kiss from 1986. Surprise, surprise.
When hearing this track, I'm definitely into Prince's signature sound, in this case, a combination of funk and pop. I love the repetition throughout the track. I love how sexually charged it is. And what can I say? This is a song about a man who wants a real woman and not one that is, materialistic, which is a theme in a lot of 80s music and film from the time period. So yeah, just awesome song. It's so fun.
Yeah, it's just so funky. It pulls you right back to the mid 80s. This is from his album Parade, which was the soundtrack for his film Under the Cherry Moon. James, you're a film scholar, so I'm curious, what did you think of that film?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning this. I will have a full review for you on the next pod.
I mean, just one of those classic films that like everybody's seen, so.
I know. I remember listening to this song in 1986. I missed the cinematic experience, and I haven't gone back, so I'm missing out.
Yeah, I guess a gap that we probably all need to fill, right?
That's correct.
So this was released as the lead single before the album released or the film released. It was a number one hit and spent 2 weeks on Billboard's Hot 100. And then notably in 2021, when Rolling Stone put out the 500 greatest songs of all time, it slotted in at number 85. I thought that was kind of funny, though, because looking back at the 1986 Billboard Hot 100, it was song number 19, behind like a bunch of songs I'd never heard of before. I listened through a handful of them and was just like, these are unfamiliar to me. So it's interesting to think through sort of that tension of like what's popular in a given moment, but then also what has staying power. Clearly, this is a song that has staying power. It even recharted in 2016 following Prince's passing. I also thought it was interesting. It had sort of a weird little origin story that I found online. He originally recorded a demo of this song that was completely acoustic, and then was recording at a music studio, and then passed the demo to this funk group called Maserati that was recording at the studio next to his, and they were like, sick. We get to collaborate with Prince. Let's just funk this song up. And then they gave it back to him and he was like, great, thanks. And then just went with that, didn't credit them at all. And they were really upset because they thought that they were going to get onto his album, which I was like, that's kind of wild. Just thanks for all this work. Love the sound. No recognition of it.
Wow.
Yeah.
What is it about this specific song that makes you think of it as defining for the 1980s? Thinking about what the 80s were, what is it about this song that stands out to you?
Yeah, so I was born in 89, so just only ideas about the 80s from culture that I've consumed. But I think of it as just a really vibrant, busy time. I mean, you look at how people were dressing in the 80s and media that has stuck around since the 80s. It seems like just such an interesting decade to me. And so I think that this track feels like it has that vibe or that aura of feeling really like a lot of variety within the track, but also just a fun listen. I also wanted to touch on an essay that I actually just read a couple of weeks back that I was looking up, like, what have I read from the 1980s? And I was like, oh, that's 86. Perfect. It's Richard Ben Kramer's What Do You Think of Ted Williams Now? Which was published in Esquire in 1986 and then was collected into the Best American Essays collection in 1987. Just a fascinating exploration of, like, one of the greatest baseball players of all time. But the writer goes and just hangs out with Ted Williams in Florida. Post-baseball career, Williams just went, like, wild with fishing. One of the greatest fishers of, like, a particular style of fishing off the coast of Florida. People were just like, he's like a legend in fishing. And so he goes and, like, just hangs out with Ted Williams and just captures this snapshot of, like, how terrible of a person Ted Williams was to be around. Like, it sounds like he just suffered through being with Ted Williams to write this essay. Just terrible to, like, every person in his life. So it's really interesting to sort of look at the whole of his career and how committed he was to being the best at baseball or fishing, but also how he was just so toxic to those around him. I thought it was sort of interesting because he's originally from San Diego, grew up in North Park at 4121 Utah Street. So he's, like, playing baseball as a kid at what's now Ted Williams Field in North Park. Just a brilliant essay that I think, worth reading.
Yeah, the idea of the disillusionment, which in this case is very positive, i.e. the difference between perception and reality. I think that can function as a nice segue into the song I'm going to play next, which is Charlotte Sometimes by The Cure.
I think that this track does a really nice job of contrasting the fun vibrancy that's in the Prince track from 86 with some of the bleakness and sort of grimness of the 1980s. I don't love The Cure, which I think you know.
Yeah.
But I can appreciate this song. I mean, I think it is evocative of that time period in a really nice way.
When I think through the vibrancy and the colorful nature of your Prince track, I have to shout out a 1986 song by Madonna entitled True Blue. I love that song so much, and I love that vibe. But I think that you're right. This Cure ethereal sound is really really complements the essay you mentioned. What do you think of Ted Williams Now? Because it's that seedy underbelly of capital and the religiosity and the moral majority of that 1980s time period. I cheated a little bit in choosing Charlotte Sometimes. It's from a compilation album that The Cure put out in 1986, but its original release was as a non-album single in 1981. I still wanted to come back to this, though, because thinking through film of the 1980s and 1986 specifically, it was a great year for youth cinema. All right, in this year, Stand By Me was released, famously based on Stephen King's 1982 novella titled The Body, which I love as well. Ferris Bueller's Day Off is from 1986, all right? So there's all that fun, the pink high tops and the Bermuda shorts and all that. But the same year, Tim Hunter released a film entitled River's Edge. And it's a 1986 American crime drama. Some people have even described it as a horror film. Salon magazine has described it as, quote, the darkest teen film of all time, end quote. It musically would be really interesting to focus on further in terms of our podcast here because it has artists like Slayer and Agent Orange on the River's Edge soundtrack. But it's just such a bleak film, and it deals with the death of a young person. This tragic situation is presented among a friend community of teenagers, and none of them seem to care or have any ability to respond emotionally or have any kind of empathy. And it's a really challenging watch. And in fact, I wanted to focus on it a little bit longer, and it's just so bleak. I decided to put it into the wider context of youth films in general. While there was all these new sounds and new experiences and new financial opportunities, there was a there was another story being told at the same time. And for me, when I think back on the 80s, it's Charlotte Sometimes is the soundtrack of the 80s for me now. And even if you were to play every optimistic commercial and show film highlights and all of the the technology, Nintendo and all that came out, even if everyone was smiling, I still think that Charlotte Sometimes is the soundtrack for me, even as I replay those memories as well as important pop culture moments. So it's all blended together, but I think that somehow The Cure and the essay that you brought up today understood one of those chords that creates the rope of the 1980s experience. And it wasn't all melancholy, obviously, but that's kind of how I see it in retrospect and why I wanted to just reflect on it in thinking about 1986 specifically.
As someone who lived through the 80s, a question for you.
Yeah.
Is that sort of the feeling you had as somebody going through the 80s, or is that now just looking back at that decade what you feel?
Yeah, I think it's more about looking back.
Okay.
Because I think there was the surface, and then I think there were some people that were actually tapped into what was going on. And so I think that it's more of in retrospect, and I think it's a correction, maybe an overcorrection, but definitely a sound that I'm grateful for to help make sense of that time period.
Yeah. That's cool. So at the time, you felt like you were in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, but now you see that it's Charlotte Sometimes.
Yeah, I think that, yes. And I think that it's because the Ferris Bueller's Day Off was the fantasy.
Sure.
And that is, and it's important to have those dreams and aspirations and that kind of positivity. But when I look back, I wonder what it was built on. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways of thinking through what it was built on is the legacy of the people that powered that moment. And I think we're seeing that politically today, a kind of desire to return to that moment. And I find it in the present tense oddly terrifying.
Sure.
And I think there's a lot of destruction in that desire. So the fantasy is gone now.
Sure.
And so it helps me understand what was actually powering and motivating that time period. And, I still feel with hope, politically, economically, and otherwise, but I have a different perspective of the rearview mirror now.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting because film-wise, I think of like John Hughes as like 1980s film.
Yeah,
like
for sure.
That's what I think of.
Yeah.
And I'm real curious about your sort of modern parallel with today, because that sort of tracks with what politically I think of with the 80s. Yeah,
I think so as well. I think there's a desire to return to that moment, and we can't return to that moment. And the legacy of the 1980s that hasn't entirely been dealt with is something that we're still dealing with now. Mm-hmm. And so I do think it's important to revisit it. I also think that, again, I'm going to shout out that documentary from the UK that I watched, Shifty, that traces the 1980s. There's so many similarities between the rise of Thatcherism and the rise of Trumpism in the U.S. And so I think we do well to revisit that decade and pay attention to all of it. And like I said, I love Prince and I love Madonna, and I also love, what The Cure did as well.
Yeah, I'm now 3/4 of the way through the first episode of Shifty, loving it, and I'm definitely seeing the parallels that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Cool. Well, thank you all for listening today. Thanks as always to our producer, Danny Martinez. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Talk to you later.